Hello, everyone. Happy Friday to you. It's right at the top of the hour, so we just opened up the room. We're giving everyone just a moment to get settled into our podcast virtual learning space. I'm Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and I am your host of Intentional Conversations. And this is where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership and business. We have been expecting you, and we're super excited that you have decided to join us for this hour of time. If you would, go to the chat, let us know where you are joining the conversation from today. Place those cities into the chat. Yes, represent well for your city. We're always glad to know that we have an audience from all types of geographies, even folks who join us from other countries, and we don't take that lightly. So thank you so very much. We do have closed caption that's available. That's our way at NWC of showing up and supporting disability inclusion. So if that's of use to you, then know that that has been enabled. I also want to welcome you all, especially if this is your first time. We know that many of you join week after week, and we don't take that lightly. So thank you so very much. I want you to leverage the chat. Yes, Megan, I see you from California. Let us know what's coming up for you into the chat. If there are some resources or sentiments or words of affirmation that feels appropriate to share while we're learning with and from each other, I want you to see the chat as an extension of this community and as a way to get as proximate to each other as possible. We enjoy that. I also want to shout out the NWC team who works tirelessly week after week to make sure that we can bring this virtual production to the broader community. I see you, Toki in Canada. Welcome, welcome. Yes, keep going to the chat. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. I really do appreciate that. Of course, we have North Carolina represented. We have South Carolina, which is where we are headquartered, and WC is, but we are 100% remote. So our colleagues are all over because our clients are all over, and that model serves us well. Great. Welcome again to Intentional Conversations VodCast. Yes, let's let the conversations begin, and we will start right here. So if you're just joining us, I am Dr. Nika White, your host of Intentional Conversations VodCast. I am the founder and lead principal consultant of NWC, and we're so glad that you're here joined with us today. This podcast is all about intersecting conversations of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging with leadership and business. And so we have a wonderful guest co-host that I cannot wait to introduce you to. But before we get to that moment in time, I always like to make sure that we acknowledge some national observances, just so that you have them top of mind. And so in October, we are recognizing ADHD Awareness Month. True story, just last night, I had dinner with a girlfriend that I've known since like middle school, right? And so we went to college together, but one of my besties, and she shared with me, because we hadn't seen each other in a while, that she just recently got diagnosed with adult ADHD. And so it just created this long conversation. And what I'm mindful of and what I'm bringing to each of you as part of this community is that, if you're experiencing some signs, don't feel like just because maybe in your adult years, you can't go and get diagnosed. I mean, she actually was able to get some coping from a therapist as well as some medication, and it's working for her. So my point is, don't wait. It's not too late if you feel like you need to go and get a diagnosis. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we go through the steps. And so ADHD Awareness Month is happening in October. October is also National Women's Small Business Month. And as I've been sharing with you all month long, as a Black woman founder, I would be remiss if I did not bring to this community the pleasure and the honor of being able to amplify the message of women's small business. We do make a big role and impact in the community with how in which we contribute to the economy and how we help support families with jobs. And so women, keep doing the darn thing. I see you. And I applaud you for all of your efforts. My LinkedIn Learning course, which is all about individual accountability for equity and inclusion, it's released in June of this year. We have reached over 10,000 learners so far, and I am super excited because next month I'll be back in California recording 2 new LinkedIn Learning courses to be released after the first of the year. And I will bring that information, of course, to this podcast community, and want to thank you so far for your support. Now, if you are someone who likes our content, maybe because you've been exposed to our podcast, or maybe you follow us on LinkedIn, I want to also make you aware of another opportunity. We do have a LinkedIn newsletter called Inclusion Insider, where we are dropping new content, new articles multiple times a month. And so I invite you to subscribe to our LinkedIn newsletter and stay informed and continue to see this as a resource for deepening your knowledge and understanding of all things DEIB. Okay, so this is the point in time where I give you a little bit of what you can look forward to in future weeks with our guest co-host of Intentional Conversations VodCast. And so October 22nd, actually 27th, I look forward to welcoming Dr. Marilyn Frazier. And in that Intentional Conversations, we're going to be discussing how the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health helps to increase health education in vulnerable communities, including their initiative to address mental health and the Black maternal crisis, a topic that we need to amplify. And so I hope that you will join us on October the 27th. And then you'll see here as we move into the month of November, we also have a great slate of amazing guest co-hosts who are going to be joining us. But I will go ahead and plant the seed that the week of November the 20th is Thanksgiving. So we will not be here. We hope that you're going to be spending some time with your families and your loved ones. And as we will be doing that as well. Okay, so we are now booking for Q1 of 2024. I think we have maybe a good portion of it already booked up, but now is your chance to let us know if you are aware of anyone in your network that you think we need to bring to our podcast community. We would love to hear from you. And so you can send your recommendations to my colleague, Amora Carter, simply at amora@nikawhite.com. And many of our guests who have been on in the almost 4 years that we've been in existence have come from your recommendations. And so we do want to hear from you, and thank you in advance for sharing those names and references along. Okay, so at this time, you know what happens. I always take a moment to formally introduce our guest co-host for the week, and I always do so by reading their bio. Now, I do this because I think it's critically important for all of us to know the accolades, the credentials, the experience in which our guest co-hosts show up to the conversation. So I am going to now do the honors of reading Dr. Ella Washington's bio, and I'm so excited for you to meet her and hear all of her wonderful insight. Dr. Ella F. Washington is an organizational psychologist and DEI expert with a wealth of experience through her involvement as the founder and CEO of Elevate Solutions, a professor of practice at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business, and the co-host of Gallup's Center of Black Voices Cultural Competence podcast, as well as the author of The Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion. Dr. Washington continues to deepen her research and pipeline thought leadership as a Gallup senior scientist studying race, strengths, and other DEI workplace topics. Dr. Washington's global human capital consulting experience has allowed her to impact clients across a myriad of industries, including financial services, sports and entertainment, oil and gas, higher education, and government. Previously, Dr. Washington led the diversity and inclusion function at Gallup as a subject matter expert, where she provided insights to clients on issues of inclusion, culture, strategic diversity, and engagement. Her research and client work focuses on women in the workplace, barriers to inclusion for diverse groups, and working with organizations to build inclusive cultures. She has conducted inclusive audits, developed learning workshops, and she also has facilitated strategic planning sessions with executive leadership teams who have goals of intentionally, one of my favorite words, improving diversity and inclusion. These experiences inspired the 2016 founding of her company, Elevate Solutions, an integrated DEI strategy firm. Elevate Solutions, an integrated DEI strategy firm, provides dynamic diversity and inclusion strategy and training for organizations looking to commit to systematic cultural changes in how they recruit, develop, engage, and assess performance. Dr. Washington's in-depth experience in this area stems from both her research on racial and gender disparities in corporate leadership positions, as well as her global DEI consulting experience with Fortune 100 government and nonprofit organizations. She grew up in Durham, North Carolina, with a tight-knit family, and that gave Dr. Washington her roots. She proudly attended Spelman College, a historically Black women's institution in Atlanta, which led to her passion for maximizing the success of women and minorities. After earning her PhD in 2014 at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she currently resides. Dr. Washington is passionate about teaching, and she truly loves the impact that she is able to make on the lives of future business leaders every day as a professor at Georgetown. And her impact is powerful as she received the Excellence in Teaching Award from Georgetown's MBA class of 2021 and is selected as a 2023 Poets and Quants 40 Under 40 MBA professors. And Dr. Washington enjoys being active in her church, giving back to her local community, traveling the world, and staying closely connected to loved ones. And so, if you would, VodCast community, help me to welcome our guest co-host, Dr. Ella, my friend, by pulling out those emojis, those accolades, affirmations, whatever it is, those reactions, but let her know how grateful we are that she is here with us today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can bring her into full view. I'm going to add you to the spotlight, friend. I'm so excited that you're here. I love visiting with you recently in your city, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. Now, Dr. Ella, I'm going to give you a chance to greet this audience in your own way, but before doing that, one of the things that we always ask of our guest co-hosts is to share something with us that we would not know about you from reading your bio, which I just did, or even looking at your LinkedIn profile. So what is it that you can share with our community today?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. White, for having me. Thank you for the warm welcome. I don't know that I've ever been in a virtual room that felt so warm. So thank you for welcoming me in such a way, and thank you to the community. I'm already seeing the messages in the chat, and virtual connection can be difficult, but you have done a great job of establishing this community. So thank you for letting me be a guest in it. Let's see, something that folks wouldn't know about me. There's so much I feel like. To me, social media is just a slither of like who you really are. But one thing I'm really passionate about is travel. And I have been ever since I graduated college. And not travel in the sense of, fancy vacations. That's nice, but it took me a long time to be able to afford anything like that. But in grad school, I remember, using every little bit of money that I had, like could scrape up to be able to travel and stay in hostels and to get the cheapest ticket I could. Because for me, every time I travel, I am humbled by the human experience. And it
Mm,
helps me to remember that, many of the problems that I think I have, there's so much greater things happening in the world. And it also humbles me in terms of how much I still have to learn. Like, you never know
right.
everything there is to know about life, but about culture, about people, and that the way that we do things here in the United States, where I live and have lived all my whole life, it's not the only way to see the world. And so
Right.
I've been over 40 countries at this point. So working my way towards 50, and I've learned something every single stop of the way.
That is awesome. That's pretty impressive. 40 countries. And I saw where recently you spent some time in Dubai, right? And that was actually through Georgetown, right? Do you want to share maybe a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So interesting. Anytime I teach DEI in another country, I'm always very cognizant of the cultural differences. And I
Yeah.
try to be, again, in the position of learning, because while I know a lot, I don't know everything, right? And so what was so amazing about the students that I had in Dubai, they were executive MBA students, with so vastly different, diverse experiences, careers, industries, etc. And it's funny, a pivot that I made, I said, okay, I'm not going to call this DEI because that could be a US centric thing, right? So I'm going to call
Yeah.
this, inclusive leadership, which is
Yeah.
universal, right? But what was so fascinating, as soon as I got in the room and we were talking, they wanted to talk about like the nuts and bolts of DEI. They didn't want to just talk about inclusive leadership from a broad
Nice.
perspective. They were excited to share the things that they had been doing in the Dubai government over in recent years, but also like what their organizations were doing and what things they were struggling with. And that was just so refreshing because it really just showed the global imperative of
Yeah.
diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how even in places where we may be very different in some ways, we all can kind of, rally around this sense of elevating humanity in the workplace, which is what I focus
Yes.
on in my work, as well as, the opportunity for everyone to thrive in their workplaces.
Hmm. No, I appreciate the amplification of the contextual nuance that sometimes we have to be keenly aware of when we have the broad, inclusive, conversation in other global markets. And so, and you talked about centering humanity. You and I share that as part of how we show up to this space and this work. And I think that it's appropriate. I did this last week, and so I want to do it this week as well. Many of us are continuing to hold in mind the horrific tragedies that are taking place, the innocent lives, and how humanity is being really challenged, for a lot of people and families as we think about the war. And so I'm really curious. We won't spend a whole lot of time here, but I'm really curious, Dr. Ella, because I know that you have students, so you have like young adults that maybe a little bit of a different way of holding space for a community of people around just addressing what's happening right now in the world. And I want you to share with us how you've been holding space for your students, how you've been helping them to navigate the complexity of what's happening, and what you're seeing from those young impressionable minds.
So, my students that I'm specifically thinking about while I teach every level at Georgetown, I'm specifically thinking about my undergrad students because
Mm,
I can only imagine what it's like to experience the world at 18, 19, 20 in a world that social media runs everything, right? Social media,
yeah.
the internet, all of that. Like while I had that, in college, it was, I mean, I won't even tell you all the things that didn't exist. But let me tell you, most of the social media
Well, let me tell you,
platforms
social media did not exist when
didn't
I was
exist. So, and let alone for their identities to be so intricately connected to social media, right? And so, while we are all seeing these horrific images and we're seeing all of these different perspectives from one end to another, I'm confused at times, right? I'm still learning. I'm still trying to make sure that I understand what is happening, and it's very complicated. And so I held space for them this past Monday in class to say, first of all,
Mm,
I know it's difficult, right?
yeah.
I'm seeing the same images you are. I know it's jarring. First of all, just acknowledging, and that's half the battle, right? Just acknowledging that
Yeah.
something is happening. And then we had a conversation around the importance of, protecting your well-being, even in these moments, and how
Right.
allyship can look very different for different people, and that's okay. I think
Yeah.
oftentimes, as you and I have discussed, there's this notion that you have to post on social media about everything, and if you don't post, you don't care, or you're wrong, or what
Right.
have you. And while that is the opinion of some, I wanted to allow my students some alternative perspective, some perspective of, allyship in any of these situations looks like a lot of different things, you know. And so you have to find what is connected to your spirit and what feels right for you, and what you're
Mm,
comfortable with. Because, at the end of the day, there are so many ways to show up as an ally. And then we went into a dialogue around the importance of perspective taking, which is,
yeah.
aligned with empathy work and
Right.
being able to have difficult dialogues. And I thought that was an appropriate conversation given what's happening in the world, because again, you can look at any news outlet, any social media platform, you're going to see all different perspectives. And how do you navigate that? And how can you hold space for someone's perspective that may be different than your own? And this is
Right.
not to question the absolutely right to humanity and safety,
Right.
right? But in terms of, politics, in terms of even DEI sometimes, there are
Hmm.
also times where we are not really good at having conversations with people who have differing perspectives. The Dialogue
Yeah.
Project out of Duke University started in 2020, and they've done studies globally. And what comes
Mhm.
up time and time again is that we as humans have really struggled in our current
Yeah.
society to have conversations with people with differing views, even though we know we should have them, even though we know that we should lead with respect. We just struggle with that. And so I had them do some exercises around active listening, around inquiry for understanding, around having conversations and not just waiting until it's your turn to talk to jump in, really questioning
Yeah.
even why you think some of the things you think, right? Sometimes we think things because we've always been told that thing, or the media has told us this thing, and we haven't even just taken a step back and said, why do I believe this? And, where does this come
Yeah.
from? And so we did those types of activities. And for me, it was not just about the conflict happening in the Middle East. These are skills I hope that they are actively using in their lives and hopefully in the workplace in the future.
That is great. And how fortunate they are to have you to hold space for them in that way, because I do believe that sometimes we may take sight off of the importance of the skills of just how do we navigate difficult conversations, right? How do we hold space for others when we really don't know exactly what to say in the moment, but we want to stand in solidarity. And so I love that you brought Brené's Brown practice of perspective taking to the conversation, because yes, that is a part of how she likes to coach people around showing empathy. And I think that right now, that is something that each of us can really hone our skills around, is just showing up in a really empathetic way. Yeah, and people's allyship is so different. I do hate that while social media, there's a lot of positivity to it, there's also a lot of things that I think people are having to navigate carefully, right? But generally speaking, I don't like that social media has become the tell all be all for um, dictating what one's position is, right? So what I'm seeing right now is there's a lot of criticism among different individuals who feel like if someone has not made some type of public statement on social media, then either they are unaware, they're like under a rock, right? They haven't been paying attention, or they just don't care. And I find I'm perplexed by that, because just leveraging the words that you use, people's allyship looks different. And this is not one of those situations where we easily can just kind of gravitate to the center and, place a stake in the ground to say, this is where I sit and this is where I'm going to remain. And so I appreciate your perspective. I'm definitely sharing a lot of those same sentiments right now.
Well, I'm
Okay.
humbled when I
Yeah.
think about it. Just one more thing. It's like, I often talk about in my book, I start talking about how in the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, I didn't go to one protest
Yeah.
because for me, it was a health concern. It was still very much in the midst of COVID. There were no vaccines at that time.
Yeah.
It was a health concern for me and my family. And I felt bad at first because I'm like, how am I this DEI person?
Yeah.
And, I'm not going down the street
Yeah.
in DC to these protests. But that was the first time I really had to internalize the fact that, my allyship is much better used in the writing that I'm doing, in the teaching that I'm doing. I can very
Absolutely.
much be an ally in that way. And that's probably how I can be a best ally, by leaning into my strengths. And so I just offer that perspective because we often think that allyship looks like one particular thing, but it is so many things.
No, that's so true. I love that you brought that to the conversation, because that is so incredibly true. And what a great example. I think if we can find a lot of parallels to how many people showed up during the George Floyd murder situation, to maybe how in which they're also processing what's happening here, and thinking about how to show up. So you referenced your book. I do want to talk about your book. Again, it's entitled, and there's a visual in the background, but it's entitled The Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion. So, and I have to imagine that the use of the language real progress was very intentional. And so first, I want you just to kind of unpack that for us. There's a story behind using those words very deliberately as part of your title. So tell us about that and what inspired the book.
So, in the DEI world, we have said it's a journey for a long time. That is, I did not make that up.
Yes.
That is not new. I've heard that, probably since the first day I even learned what DEI
Yes.
is all about. But what I was finding, particularly in 2020, is that while a lot of leaders were saying, we're on the journey and we're really engaged and we really care about these issues, many people did not even understand what the journey was all about. It's easy to say
Mhm.
it's a journey, but it's much harder to codify in your mind, like what actually that journey entails, especially when it comes to DEI. And so, what I wanted to do is kind of demystify what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about, And
Yeah.
do that through the lens of real lived experiences. So my book is a compilation of 9 case studies from real organizations who so graciously allowed me to not only lift up the hood of what was happening in their organizations, but to dig around and poke around
Yep.
and really unearth, where they had been on their journey, where they were at that moment in 2022, and also where they wanted to go. And so for me, it was all about, again, demystifying what DEI is all about. And my goal was that every single person who read the book and who reads the book, even today,
Mm.
can see themselves at some place on the journey, because we are
Yeah.
all on a journey here. Our organizations
Hmm.
are on a journey. We individually, each of us is on a journey. And so for me, the book and sharing those real life experiences in the format of narrative and stories was what I hope that people would connect with.
Yeah, and kudos to all of the organizations that were willing for you to tell their stories. I mean, because to your point, a lot of times the journey is messy, and sometimes we may be reluctant for people to kind of see where we've made some misses, where we have had to go back and reimagine and to pivot and to redo and to apologize. But I think that what is probably comforting to a lot of folks is just being able to realize that there within this journey there are going to be some ebbs and flows, some highs, some lows, some wins and some losses, and so we have to just see it all as part of that growth process. And so I always appreciate when organizations are willing to kind of share their stories. And when I often ask questions about, give me one word that you would use to describe, like, this work of equity and inclusion, necessary comes up. So the title of your book is so very appropriate. I want to talk about what you're seeing, Dr. Ella, in terms of the evolution of DEI. We know that it is evolving. And, we see that even in just the past 3 or so years, when we think about the pandemic, and then, of course, we think about how visible the murder of George Floyd was. And even now, what we're dealing with the war, these social issues across the globe are definitely impacting and influencing how in which the DEI conversation is evolving. So, can you share a little bit about what you're seeing the evolution to be, and where you think that there's opportunities for those of us who really champion this work to be a bit more prepared to do it effectively, to where the work and the outcomes can be sustained?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all felt this sense of whiplash from where we
Yeah.
were before 2020, and then in 2020, and then where we are in 2023. And what's
Mhm.
curious to me as a scholar who has spent my whole career in this space, and so this is not the first time we've seen the pendulum swing, right? We have seen since the 1960s, the
Yep.
pendulum swings and it will continue to. And so to me,
Yeah,
that's
for
not
sure.
the biggest challenge. I think part of the biggest challenge is realizing that that's going to happen, because a lot of people thought 2020 was it. We
Yep.
have
Yep.
arrived. And I knew then what is true now, that we have not arrived, that we hopefully had made progress forward, but I was never
Mhm.
under the impression that we had arrived and we would never be having this conversation that we're having today. However, what I will say, the surprise has been for me is how quickly the pendulum has swung. Like, I did not imagine
Yeah.
we would have such fervor in 2020, to have such fervor in the extreme opposite direction just in 2023. In From a historical standpoint, it's usually taken, a decade
Right.
or so to see
Right.
that swing, at least, a presidential change, at
Right.
least to see that swing.
Yeah.
And so, um, what I'm saying today is, two kind of trends. I think the first trend is for the organizations who really weren't committed in the first place. This point in time has been
Yeah.
their exit strategy. It
Yeah.
has been an excuse to get off of the train. It has
Yeah.
been the reason to pull back on those bold statements maybe they feel like they had to make in 2020. It's been like, whew, okay, I'm glad that's over,
Yep.
right? I feel like a collective sigh of relief in some camps.
Yeah.
have We've seen that, right? And that has
Mhm.
translated into, we no longer have an interest in doing the same type of activities. We don't have the budget. We're not going to backfill the role of chief diversity
Mhm.
officer that we just instituted in 2020.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying many organizations explicitly pull back, but those implicit behaviors are very telling. And so, one
Yeah,
piece of advice I say, pay attention to what your organization is doing and not doing, and ask questions, because
yeah,
it's likely not going to show up as a complete reversal, but it will show up in what they're not doing, in the positions they don't backfill, the resources that all of a sudden have disappeared because of the economy, or what have you.
right.
And so we have to hold our leadership accountable. I think that that is the main thing. The second trend that I am seeing, and what still encourages me very much, is that I am seeing a lot of organizations that still want to push forward on their journey, but they're just confused. They don't know how to do that with the changing landscape. And so they're working more closely with their legal teams than they ever had before, which I think is a good thing, because it's a necessary thing. Like, that's where we
Sure.
are. While 5 years ago, maybe we didn't have to consult with legal with everything we do, maybe we do now. That's where we are. And so the organizations that have embraced that, embraced those strategic partnerships internally, even externally, and understanding that, for much of the work, they can still move forward.
Yeah.
At where we are today, again, this changes. The SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action was race-based affirmative action, and it was for institutions of higher learning, and specifically institutions of higher learning that are, government funded.
Yeah.
And so that's a very specific lane, right? And I'm happy to share the HBR article Dr. Opie and I wrote on this. At the moment, it does not directly impact corporate efforts. Now, I am very well aware of the 33 states and counting that have, you know, legislation out there, that many of them are around college DEI programs, but some of them may lean into corporate. So I'm not saying that there's no impact. I definitely think there will be a downstream impact. So it's something that we should be paying attention to. But if your
Yeah.
organization is committed, now is not the moment to say, okay, well, we can't do it anymore. If you want to do it, there are ways that we can continue to move forward in a legal and
Yeah.
very aware, approach.
Absolutely. And I think that that needs to be reiterated. So I'm so glad that you brought that up today, because there are some who are seeing this as, now I'm defeated. What's the use? Right. And I think that that mindset is creating fear. It's creating, this notion of we can't overcome this. And I believe that if we don't shift our mindsets to think more positively about how we may need to reimagine a little bit differently, then we're going to find ourselves kind of stuck. And so, and I don't want that. Um, so you talk a lot about workplace utopia,
Mm.
and I want to just kind of unpack that for a moment. I know that as you are supporting different organizations on their DEI journeys, you bring workplace utopia to the conversations. And so I want you to share with this community what that is and why it's important to internalize the learning behind that concept of workplace utopia.
So, when I think about this work specifically, it is hard. Like, we
Of
know, as
course.
practitioners,
Yes, hands
researchers,
down.
as allies, it is hard work. So for me, Workplace Utopia was originally birthed from the sense that, if for me, if I don't have something to look forward to, if I don't have hope and optimism, if I can't see a different future, at least in my mind, then I am not able to do this work every day with the same passion and energy that I have. And I find that with like-minded practitioners as well, and researchers, that, like, we have to have something, some guiding light, something that we're working towards, right? And when I started to think about this concept of workplace utopia, it is not about unicorns and butterflies and a perfect workplace. And it's not about all the free stuff that the organization can give us,
Right.
skills and all that. That's great. But for me, workplace utopia is more so, what is the work environment that I can thrive, that every single person can thrive?
Yeah.
And the workplace utopia is a little different for everyone, which I think is the beauty of it. So we're never going
Yeah.
to get to a sense of universal workplace utopia. But for me, it's more about how can we all imagine workplaces of the future, workplaces where each one of us can thrive. And the more that we share those things that can create our own workplace utopia with our leaders, with our managers, with our organizations, I hope the closer that we all move towards that. And so in my book, after every interview, I asked the leader that I was interviewing, what does workplace utopia look like for you in the future? And it's so amazing that every single statement was different, but it was beautiful in its own right. And the more that we share those things, whether it's, I thrive in a workplace where I can be my full self, meaning I can be a little goofy sometimes, or I thrive in a workplace that allows me to lean into my quantitative skills because that's what I really like. And I just like to crunch the numbers every day, like whatever that means for you, sharing that and building community around that. I think that's how we get closer to what we're actually working for in this effort.
Yeah, and I do think it's really useful for leaders to take some time during those clarity breaks or critical reflection moments to think about what do you want the experience to be of our colleagues, right? That show up for us every single day. And I think that what makes it somewhat challenging is that those answers are going to vary from one person to the next. And so then the question becomes, well, how do you create now this what seems like a unicorn of a culture and a workplace environment that really drives towards all these different things that people have a need for? And so I would love for you just to talk about how do you navigate questions like that may come your way, because it can feel like is this even realistic for us to believe that it can exist? So how can organizations really create that when it's so vastly different from one person to the next?
So first you have to listen, right? So if you ask 10 different people what their ideal workplace is, you're going to get 10 different answers. Absolutely.
Of course,
But if you take a moment to really process what is being said, there are usually some themes that'll come up. I
very
want a
true.
workplace that I can trust. I want a workplace where I feel heard. I want a
Yeah,
workplace that values my unique abilities, right? And so I want a workplace that's fun, like whatever those things are. What I've seen is that they usually, funnel into different categories. And if the workplace is listening, there are probably already things that they're doing or can be doing
yeah,
to meet those needs, right? So while what fun looks like to one person may be from a different person, what we can do is make sure that we're leaning into our social community in this workplace because that's what we're hearing people want more of, right? The other thing
yeah.
that I encourage people to do is allow employees and team members to co-create what this workplace of the future looks like. So it's HR's job on the policies and practices, right? But we talk about culture and how we do
Yeah.
things every day, let us co-create that. So you say you want a workplace where you feel more heard. What does that look like for you? What are some examples of things that you
Mm.
could do differently or better? Let's get together and co-create this environment. It will never be perfect, but we certainly can move towards, this sense of feeling where everyone can thrive and show up as their best selves.
No, I love that. So this is the time where I will let our audience know that we're going to be shifting momentarily, and I will open it up for questions and comments so that you all can contribute to this conversation if you desire to do so. So if you're part of our Zoom community, you can let me know that you're interested in that by using the raise hand feature, and then I will invite you to unmute and I will spotlight you so that you can share. But if you're just here kind of in an observatory capacity, but you do have some curiosities you're holding, you can go to the chat and you can share your questions that way. And I will present them on your behalf. And so I'll give you a chance to kind of percolate on that. I'll go to my next question and then I'll look around to see if we have some takers on that offering. But I want to talk a little bit now about again, we mentioned the DEI progress, but I find that there are a lot of organizations that are feeling stuck right now for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's because it's the end of year, budgets run out, and they're trying to like really secure budget for the upcoming year. And maybe that's a challenge because people are questioning the, validity of whether or not we need to continue doing this work. I mean, it's all the things, right? And so for those who are feeling stuck in their DEI progress, what are some ways that you suggest they can reinvigorate the dialogue without having to reinvent the wheel and just feel like all of the momentum and traction that they perhaps have garnered now is in vain? What do you share with those in folks?
I asked them to go back to their why, and not because from a place of why is this important. You probably know why it's important if you're leading this work, right? But
Yeah,
what is your why in terms of what are you actually trying to accomplish, right? Like we need the metrics, we need the numbers, we need the programs, but all of that stems from what we actually are trying to accomplish. And so I think this is a great opportunity for organizations. We do something with organizations at Elevate Solutions called DEI tune-up. It's a great opportunity for
yeah,
a tune-up, kind of just like we tune up our cars,
yeah,
every
yes,
every year, a few times a year. Our strategy, DEI strategies also need a tune-up. We have to navigate the changing landscape, but we also have to have an opportunity to circle back and say, okay, what do we accomplish? What do we want to move forward? Like, what is our why moving forward? And so I think oftentimes if we're not clear on what we're actually trying to accomplish, it can be hard when we think about one specific program or one specific thing, but it
Right.
should be about one specific program. It should be about, okay, we are trying to create an environment where people feel a higher sense of belonging. We felt like that was a gap previously. That's what we're trying to achieve in the future. Okay, so if we are clear on that why, maybe we can't have that same program next year because it costs $25,000 and we don't have that in the budget. But that does not mean we can't think about ways to increase senses of belonging within this organization, you know? And so for
Yeah.
me, we get caught up on the programs and the structures, which are very important, but when we get caught up on those and don't recenter and think about our why and what exactly we are trying to accomplish, and the fact that there are multiple ways to accomplish these things, I think that's what keeps us stuck, especially in moments like this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I am hearing, and I have been for some time, some rumblings around we need to evolve from bias and microaggressions. People are tired of that now. It's like it's kind of overdone. And yeah, maybe in some spaces. But here's my question for you. How do we keep bias and inequities front and center of the conversation? Because I know that's where people often start, that's where they plant their seed, and I think people feel like it's kind of overdone, but I'm not seeing the change that I believe we have the ability to see. And so I know I'm continuing the conversations, I know that you're continuing the conversations. What do you say to those folks who feel like we need to move on and evolve from that?
You know, it's interesting that is the conversation, because where I like to center is that bias specifically is part of the human condition. And so
Yeah.
I don't look at bias as like a DEI conversation per se. Like, yes, it is
Yeah.
on those lines, but when I'm talking to clients, we are just level setting that as humans, we are biased because that is the way our brains
Yeah.
work. And
Yep.
microaggressions, it's the same conversation. As humans, we have all committed a microaggression, experienced and been on the receiving end of a microaggression, and likely have been a bystander of a microaggression. And so for me, I try to level it in terms of like, this is something that we all experience. This is not just for the
Right.
folks who are DEI proponents. This is not just for the folks who are
Yeah.
anti-DEI. This is for everyone. And this helps us to make a better workplace for each of us. And so
Mhm.
when I phrase it like that, I find that people are a bit more open to understanding that it will continue to be an evolving journey, especially when you highlight that everyone is biased and everyone has
Right.
had these experiences. Everyone, including myself and yourself, have committed microaggressions or made assumptions about people, you know. And so having to remind people that I think is key. But I'd love to know, like, kind of how do you address those questions when you get them?
Yeah, well, in a very similar way. I mean, when we think about some of the new language, relatively new, I should say, that's found its way into the vernacular of the space of DEI, whether it's, allyship and intersectionality and some of these other terms, it really does have a lot of connection to, again, bias as a human condition, to use your words. I mean, and so I believe that they're all connected. Even when we talk about belonging, I mean, how do we allow people to have a sense of like safety in the workplace? It's because we are really cognizant of how bias can show up, how we can disrupt it, how we can, train ourselves to be much more mindful about, how which we are behaving and things that we're saying. And so I think that it's all interconnected, and we have to just help people to connect those dots in a much more intentional way. And to your point, yeah, it doesn't make us bad people, right? It makes us human. If we have warm blood running through our body, then bias has the propensity to show up. And so it's not something to run from. Rather, it's how do we equip ourselves and position ourselves to be able to combat it when it does show up, so that harm does not linger, it does not continue. We can restore those relationships, rebuild that trust. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about, the trust and the relationship. So I think it's really critical for us to keep that as part of our messaging. Um, okay, so I'm not seeing any hands right now, so I have lots of questions. I'm going to keep going. I was on a panel recently, and this was one of the questions that was presented to me, and I loved it. So I thought to myself, the next opportunity I get, I'm going to test out this question. What
Okay.
have you been saying, Dr. Ella? What have you been screaming from the mountaintop that you feel like no one is hearing? And let's just say for the next, 60 seconds, people are going to hear you. What is that?
That's such a good question. So, I remember in 2020, I posted about this and I spoke about this. And then at the end of last year, beginning of this year, posted about it, spoke about it. And I feel like it's one of those things that I wish people were listening, specifically around the positions of diversity leaders in organizations. So in 2020, we saw chief diversity officer roles at the beginning of 2020, first quarter, we saw those roles plummet
Yep.
in a way that was more than we were even seeing in HR roles more generally. So generally, when the economy has a dip, we do see HR roles shrink up in some ways. That's a soapbox for another day. But DEI roles were the hiring of them slowed even above and beyond,
Mhm.
HR roles at the beginning of 2020. Fast forward to the summer of the racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd and the $67 billion of commitment that we got, from all these organizations, and DEI roles had tripled from where they were at the start of 2020. And so, okay, again, it's that moment of arrival. I was very scared that we were going to see the same thing in 2023. So I remember at the end of last year, early this year, I said, you know, listen, let's pay attention. Let's not let history repeat itself. We
Right.
know that the economy is challenged. We know that next year will likely be a tough economic place for us in the United States. So let us be mindful of that and not treat our DEI roles as if they are expendable, because let us have learned from what happened 3 years ago. And
Yes.
unfortunately, if you look at the numbers, we are seeing the same patterns. And so, um, I think that, making a mistake is one thing, but not learning from those mistakes, letting history repeat itself, I
Right.
feel like that is, a huge challenge. And that really still pains me when I think about it. Because I'm like, we can't make progress if we keep running into the same pitfalls. Nothing wrong with a pitfall. We all have them, right? Every organization has them, every individual has them. But what is challenging for me is when we keep running into the same pitfalls because we refuse to learn from the historical lessons.
I agree. Insanity, but just continuing to do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Yeah, that's not getting us there. So I'm certainly with you on that. On a personal note, you have some different endeavors that you are endeared to, and a lot of it has to do with like your nonprofit. So I want you to share a little bit about that as well.
Absolutely. So, our nonprofit arm, Elevate Charity Foundation, we are so excited that we are launching in this quarter. And our first effort is around corporate cheat code. So, those of you on Instagram, please follow Corporate Cheat Code. It is a platform that we are using to kind of distill some myths about the workplace and encourage people from non dominant identities and how we navigate the workplace. So, no matter what your background identity is, there is a space for you. And many of us in these corporate jobs, like, no one gave us the cheat code. And so I'm trying to give it to the cheat code
Yes.
to people. And so, starting at the beginning of next year, we will have monthly free webinars that provide some of the skills and professional development that maybe our organizations are not doing because of the changes in budgets or what have you, or that's not where they're focused. Or maybe it's because you can't afford to attend the fancy conference
Yeah.
individually. So we want to provide some of those resources to our growing community. And so I would say follow Corporate Cheat Code on Instagram and stay tuned for what's to come early next year.
Yeah, there's something to be said about all of the unspoken rules that it seems like certain populations of people are exposed to sooner and more readily than people who look like you and I, Dr. Ella. And so I love the notion of how can we bring this knowledge, this insight, this wisdom to those who are not kind of in the insider club, if you will. So cheat code is kind of like I know it's a play on words there, but I certainly understand the intent behind the language there. What are some of those unspoken rules that sometimes we just don't get exposed to the same degree as others that you can just kind of give us a little bit of flavor for what participating in the cheat code community would do for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, negotiating, right? That's one of those things that if you know. And the
Yeah.
data tells us every day that, women, for example, and people of color, for example, do not often negotiate in the ways that we should, not only just salary, but other aspects of our workplace environment. And so, that's part of what we'll teach is like, okay, here, what are some negotiating skills 101 that we can all practice? Negotiation is a skill that you have to, develop over time. And
Yes.
many of us don't feel comfortable doing that. And so that's one area. Another area is around kind of owning your story. Oftentimes, we allow our environments to kind of tell us who we are instead of really leaning into and grabbing our own identity, our own stories, in a way that helps for us to present how we want to present in organizations. And
Yeah.
so kind of just taking the reins there. Other areas around, power and influence. And I speak
Yes.
to many communities of color, for example, and women's organizations, and they say, I grew up thinking power was a bad word. I don't want to be
Right.
powerful because people abuse power, and that certainly is the case.
Yes.
But what we have to understand, especially in organizational working environments, is that, you need to have a sense of influence. You need to be able to build your network strategically. That is not a bad thing. That is how
Mhm.
successful. You can still do it ethically. And that doesn't mean that you abuse your power, but having power is not a bad thing. And so these are
Right.
the things that the conversations that we want to have to kind of debunk some of the things that even in our own communities that sometimes we have always said or always done, but that doesn't serve us in these workplaces that we're choosing to, be part of.
Yeah, I love a good reframe and reimagining of language. And you're right, power is one of those words that's really tricky. But I think I shared this before in the podcast, but I often hear a good friend of mine say that where it becomes a challenge is when we don't believe that we have power, right? And so if we don't believe that we have power, how can we claim something that's going to help us really, project ourselves in a way that serves us best? And so I love the idea of claiming power. So, Dr. Ella, you and I have something in common, and that you're currently on a journey, and I have been on the journey where while we both are authors, but you're working on book number two
I
in
am.
partnership with Forbes. And I don't want you to give it all away because I know it's still under lock and key, but maybe whatever is feels comfortable to you to share about book number two, I would love to give you a moment and space to do that.
Thank you so much for that. And it in my journey to alignment and making sure all the things that I'm doing are, pushing towards a certain direction, it is very much centered around the idea of corporate cheat code. So we don't know what the title will be yet, but it
Yep,
is this
yep.
idea of providing the skills and the tools for people like us to navigate these workplace environments that were not made for us, but that we
Right.
are find ourselves having to navigate. So the book will provide stories. I'm still in the very much in the narrative format. Still want to bring real life stories of people to the forefront, but also tools and skills, how to build your personal board of directors, how to negotiate that job offer. What happens when you feel like your manager doesn't like you? How do you navigate that?
Yeah.
How do you manage up and across? And how do you use, maybe Chill Downey's influence skills? How do you use that in today's world? And how do you navigate that, based on not feeling like maybe that the organization was made for someone like you? And so that is what the work will be centered on. I am excited to be working on it as we speak, and I look forward to bringing more about that project as it continues to evolve. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for sharing that. And we will definitely make sure that we have to bring you back once book number two launches. So we have maybe just about 7 minutes left, and I just want you to close us out with what have I not asked you about that you're feeling a lot of energy around these days, or you're feeling emboldened to have discussions around what's on the horizon for you. Just but share whatever it is that you're feeling a lot of energy for right now.
Lately I've been really focused on impact and kind of doing an
Yeah.
audit of myself and the work that I am doing. And not that all the work that I've done is not impactful in some way, but sometimes I think when we try to do too much, we can lose the focus in the center, right? And that's kind of what we talked about as far as DI strategy. And I think that, is in alignment with where I am in my career as well. Like, okay, how do I make sure that this next project, has focus? This next project levies the most impact. This nonprofit levies the most impact.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thought I would provide for this community that, it is okay to do a personal audit. When you're feeling like things are not aligned or maybe they could be better aligned, I encourage people to do that. I think that's a conversation that we don't often have, especially for, those of us who maybe have been on a certain career path or trajectory. We think success looks like one particular thing. But I just want to empower everyone in this community to, it is okay to take a step back, a refresh, re-audit, realign
Mm.
with yourself and what you feel like your personal mission is. And for me, it is making sure that the work that I'm doing has the best and biggest impact for, the gifts that I feel like I've been given.
Yeah, and then also kind of aligning yourself with what are some of the other endeavors in life and desires that I have, and how can I set myself up for success to welcome those things into my life? I know that was kind of a conversation that you and I had as well,
Absolutely.
and so I think that's great. The whole notion of a personal audit. I'm all about making things practical, and so I want to give maybe just a couple tips for what does a personal audit contain and look like. What questions should people be interrogating themselves around? What are some other resources that helps people to know how to do a personal audit in the most effective way to arrive at some of those clarity points that are really instrumental towards really just landing ourselves at a place where we want to be?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some things that come to mind for me and just looking over my life in different periods is, paying attention to where there is tension or a stress
Yeah.
in life, right? I remember my therapist years ago said, like, you've been just going so fast, you haven't even stopped to pay attention to the things that are stressing you out. And I was like, what do
Yeah.
you mean? And it was something that I had to work to unpack, but when I'm feeling stressed, okay, let's not just move through that moment and move to the next thing. Let me take a step back and say, okay, what's stressing me? Are there things, there areas of improvement? Is it stressing me because it's not aligned with, my morals, or not aligned with where I want to be, or not aligned with the plan that I put in place?
Mm.
So awareness and like attention, I think, is a big thing that we miss when we're just going from meeting to meeting, thing to thing, checklist to checklist. And it's something that I often, have to think about. I'd also say making sure you have appropriate feedback loops. And so this happens at work,
Yeah.
but also in your personal life. How are you showing up? How are other people receiving you and perceiving you? And is that how you want them to perceive you? Your family will be, the quickest telltale. I remember a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with my mom, and she was needing more attention, and as in her older years, and I'm like, I just talked to you 2 days ago. Like, what's up? Like, why? Like, what's going on? And I had to take a step back, and one, be grateful that she is here with us, and
Yeah.
that she is in a place that she can ask for more of my attention,
Yeah.
but also to say, hey, pay attention to, there's a new need here. There's a new way that you're showing up or not showing up, and maybe let's shift that based on what you say is most important to you. Family is most important to you. Maybe that approach worked, 5 years ago, but now mom's in a different place, and, she needs different things. And so for me, it's like being willing to adjust and shift and
Yeah.
change, and not just being stuck in what we've always done. I think it's always easy to go on the status quo. That's why change is so hard, because even if you don't
Right.
like the status quo, it is really hard to change the status quo, even if it's bad, right? It's just part of the human condition. And so for me, it's like being willing to unearth and question, like, is the status quo still working? And if not, being willing and open to changing that.
Yeah, that is so good. And I love that you shared the story about you and your mom. And I think that, as we think about just relationships in general, maybe even relationships in the workplace, sometimes we may get to a point where we get so complacent about what we feel like we know of our colleagues, right? And they could be in a season of shift. And when they're in a season of shift, maybe what they need and how they need to be supported can look differently. And so I think we have to always make sure that we remain in this posture of mindfulness and not just taking things for granted and assuming, but asking those questions and noticing when maybe behaviors are showing signs that perhaps the needs are shifting. And so that's so good. I have enjoyed this conversation. I am grateful for your time. I know that you're super, super busy, but the fact that you spent this hour with us is really appreciated, Dr. Ella. And I want to thank this community for continuing to show up week after week. And if you found that this information was really helpful for you, then I invite you to share it with others. Let them know they can catch the replay or even the podcast when it comes out. Just, actually maybe this afternoon or early next week. But we're grateful that you're here with us. We hope that you will join us again next week. And everybody be safe, remain healthy, and let's make sure we're taking care of each other. Okay. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Nika, for having me.
Thanks.